Digging up our family's history. I've been looking at articles about capturing your family story. There are lots of ideas out there. You can start by making a timeline of major life events, using family photos, keepsakes, and such to trigger memories when talking to relatives, or collect oral stories from your family and write them down and so on. Lots of good hints. And then I remembered how I came to experience part of our family history. Every so often, my Grandma and Grandpa Webb would get a letter from Missouri, where Grandpa Webb came from as a young teen when his parents moved to Compton. These letters were from his Uncle Frank and Aunt Anna Foster in Missouri. Since Grandpa came to California as a young boy, and he always told us kids that they had to round him up and put shoes on him to catch the train, and he had never returned, the main contact with his Missouri relatives were the letters received and shared between them. By the way, notice that red arrow pointing to lot 32 on the plot map? That's where Frank and Anna lived. As a kid, I was always fascinated with this part of Grandpa's history and enjoyed hearing Grandma read the letters. Talk about telling family stories. At just about every family get-together after dinner, Grandpa would tell stories, and many times he talked about coming from Missouri as a young boy, and one thing was especially intriguing was that his ice skates were left behind under the porch of their home when he had to leave. And I guess Grandpa passed his love of ice skating on because my dad and his brother and sisters loved to skate, and some of my cousins took it up too. I always wanted to go get those skates for Grandpa. Eventually, Uncle Frank passed away, but they would still get letters from Aunt Anna, and then when my sister Judy's husband, Charlie, was stationed at Fort Riley, Kansas, I got the chance to go visit them. Well, the middle of Kansas sounded close to the northeastern part of Missouri when you're way out here in California, so before I left, I asked Grandma and Grandpa for a little more detail about where Aunt Anna lived and about Noble, her son, and his wife, who were now helping to run the store that had been Uncle Frank's, just in case we could go see them. Well, it turned out while I was visiting Judy and Charlie that we were able to take a day trip to Missouri, and just to see if we could find Grandpa's aunt and family. It was only about 300 miles away, one way, and we had Michelle, who was 8 or 9 months old at the time, and Charlie had to be back for duty the next day. Easy, right? Well, it turned out to be a great adventure, and no, I didn't find the skates. They were probably long gone. At first, we wondered what we would find. Would they appreciate us dropping in? Would they be home? And lots of other questions and thoughts were going through our heads. I think we figured that if it didn't work out, we would just turn around and head back to Kansas. We knew they lived in a little town called Hedge City, but that was about all. Turns out that what was left of the town was little more than a couple of buildings, one of which was Foster's Market, where they lived in part of the store. That store was lot 32 on the old plot map. The rest of what they called Hedge City consisted of the farmers and their families in the area who dropped by the store for bread, milk, luncheon meats, and other basic supplies. Noble was able to go to the city, buy goods in bulk, and store them in his garage, and then keep the neighbors supplied with necessities so they didn't have to drive to town. Well, we finally got there and found the store and introduced ourselves, and what a welcome. That's Grace, Aunt Anna, and Noble on the porch. Of course, Aunt Anna and Noble remembered of Grandpa. Noble was born a few years after Grandpa left Missouri, but always remembered of him as Little Georgie, since Grandpa was just a kid when his folks moved to California, probably around 1902 or 1903. They were so pleased to meet us. We didn't want to impose, but they were very gracious and so happy to share family history and to hear about all of Grandpa's family in California. Then after lunch, Noble took us for a ride. We went to the grocery store where his grown son Ron worked and to meet 2 other cousins. Carl and Virgie Vandiver, whose mother was a Foster, were brother and sister, and neither one had ever married. They were Noble's and my grandpa's cousins. When we got to their place, they were out working in the yard, and Virgie was wearing a regular old-fashioned sunbonnet. We thought it was pretty neat. I remember that they were raising chickens, white leghorns that looked so cute running around the lush green yard. Come to find out, they thought the white ones were kind of ordinary and that the Rhode Island Reds that were common to us were much more interesting. I guess it's all what you're used to. At that time, Noble and Grace were running the store for Aunt Anna, and they had moved into the little home at the back of the market, leaving their home, for the time being, which was down the road, and had indoor plumbing. The kitchen at the market didn't have running water yet, and we were fascinated with the hand pump they used at the kitchen sink. It was the only way they got water into the house. And of course, there was no plumbed bathroom either. The toilet, a pit type, was in a big back room, which was also used for storage at that time. The most interesting thing was that this room was practically all windows on the side that faced the farm road right outside. It made you want to hurry before a pickup or a tractor came by. Well, we couldn't stay, even though they invited us to. Charlie had to get back to work the next day, so that night we headed home, so happy that we had been able to briefly see this part of Grandpa's story and meet some extended family. Aunt Anna passed away that year after we visited in 1970, so we were sure glad we got to visit while she was still living. Through the years, we kept in touch with Grace and Noble through Christmas cards and occasional letters. Eventually, Grace and Noble brought in modern conveniences to the store, water and indoor plumbing, and made it their permanent home, as it was more convenient to be right there at the store. Since Ray and I have been married, we were able to stop by Grace and Noble several more times with other family members on some of our trips to Ohio, where Ray's from. In 1981, the market had been freshened up, new paint, new Pepsi signs and all. In this picture of Grace and Noble, you can see some of the items they stocked in their little market, and here my sister Jane and my niece Michelle are out on the front porch. They went with us on that trip. This was Charles Foster's market, which was built in 1881 across the street from where Noble's store was. Charles Foster was Noble's grandfather. Noble told us that around 1900, Charles sold it to his daughter and her husband, Jesse and George Holman Webb, and a few years later they sold out and left for California. This is the family with the 3 kids, George Lulian, my grandfather, and Eva and Aubrey, by the log cabin which you saw earlier. Here, Noble was showing the old store to Ray. One thing I remember about it was the beautiful old tin ceiling tiles. It would have been neat to have salvaged some of those. In 1987, we were able to take my dad and mom along to Hedge City. I think Daddy especially enjoyed meeting and visiting with this cousin his father had talked about through the years. He would like to have found the skates too, but he didn't even get to see the old store built by his great-grandfather. It had been torn down since our last visit. In this picture of Grace and Noble, you get a better idea of the variety of things they carried, from seeds to high C to cereals to stovetop and so on. And they were most famous for their bologna and cheese sandwiches, it seems. In doing research, I found there is a Facebook page, Foster's Market, Hedge City, Missouri. And see that long knife on the counter at the lower right of the picture? It may have been famous. They must have used that same knife a long time. Many people remembered Grace slicing cheese and bologna for sandwiches with it. And on the Facebook page, a lot of people comment on the best bologna sandwiches which they would get there. Also on the Facebook page, it says that Dad still has it, Grace's knife, and used it at his store when the power went out a few weeks ago. Dad refers to Noble's son Ron in this case, and it was written by his daughter. This was posted 3 or 4 years ago, around 2015, at the Foster's Market, Hedge City, Missouri Facebook page. Noble's granddaughter Mary is the administrator, but I'm not sure of the status of Ron's store today. I also found a couple pictures of Foster's delivery truck. They probably used it for farm and store deliveries, both. Later, Noble took us to see the old homestead. The barn was great. All that old barn wood and the rusty tin roof. Noble even said we could have it to scrap out, but it would have taken a lot of time and effort to get it to California. It even had a great old lightning rod on top. This was at a time when old barnwood was at a premium. I remember Tony Godey here in the Antelope Valley. He painted around his old barn so that the wood wouldn't be valuable and wouldn't be stolen then. And in the left-hand picture, Daddy, Noble, and Ray were probably talking farming. Noble also told us that Hedge City got its name from the Osage orange trees, which were thick in the area and were used for hedgerows. Later, they started using the wood for fence posts because it was so rot resistant, lasting 25 years or longer. Next, Noble took us to the Harmony Cemetery in Knox County, where Charles and Miranda Foster are buried. They would be my great-great-grandparents. More of the family is now buried here. By the way, there's a great website, Find a Grave. If your ancestors' graves have been photographed and uploaded to this website, you can find pictures and other valuable information about your relatives. This was my picture from our visit, but I was able to find the graves of Carl and Virgie and others of the family, now buried at Harmony. Noble also showed us a book, Lewis, Knox, and Scotland Counties, Missouri, in 1887. It included a couple of paragraphs about Charles and Miranda Foster, who were originally from Maine. By the way, the Fosters had someone on the Mayflower, according to this book. And these were the Fosters who ended up in Hedge City. And then we took more pictures on the porch of Foster's Market. My mom, Grace, Noble, and my dad were saying goodbye as we had to get going. Sadly, this would be our last visit to Hedge City. Noble and Grace continued to run their market until they were unable to do so any longer. Noble passed away in 2001 and Grace followed in 2009. They were at the market a long time as Noble and his parents opened Foster's Market on July 24th, 1926. And check out that tree behind the gas pump to the right of the porch. As I was doing a Google Maps search to see what the market looked like now, I discovered that it was no longer standing. Foster's Market stood on the southwest corner of that intersection. It was lot 32 on the plot map you saw earlier, although the plot map was turned a different direction, so don't let that confuse you. Anyway, all that's left now seems to be that big old tree at the tip of the yellow arrow, probably the one growing to the right of the porch in many of the old pictures. And the big red equipment shed that you see there on the north corner is newer and sits just north of where that old Charles Market stood. And I learned that Noble's Market was indeed torn down, although the countertop has been saved for a museum in Knox County. And the knife was last in the hands of Noble's son, Ron, but one account said that it was to go to the museum too. And I think this whole adventure started because of the letters my grandparents would read to us early on from the family back in Missouri. Don't miss the chance to dig into the past and get acquainted with some of your ancestors and better understand your history in whatever form you can. So just to review, Charles and Miranda Foster are my great-great-grandparents on my dad's side. They came from Maine, lived in Ripley, Ohio a while, and then in 1867 came to Missouri, where he farmed on some of the best land in Knox County, according to that old history book. In 1881, he opened the first market in Hedge City, the old one across the street, and he served as postmaster from 1878 to 1887. It was also noted that he served in the late war, which would have been the Civil War, while he was still in Ohio. Charles and Miranda Foster had 9 children. Here's information about 3 of them. Phoebe Florence Foster was 7th, and she was married to Bert Vandiver, and their children included Carl and Virgie Vandiver, the brother and sister we met on our first visit. Frank H. Foster, the 8th child, married Anna Ross, and their one child was Noble Foster. Uncle Frank and Aunt Anna operated the new Foster's Market, started in 1926, and then Noble and Grace took over when Frank passed away, and Anna needed the help. And then there's Jessie Foster, the 4th child. She was born while they still lived in Ohio and would marry George Holman Webb. He came to Hedge City from West Virginia. This is where our branch of the family came from. George Holman Webb and Jesse had 3 children, George Lulian, Eva, and Aubrey Webb, and this is the family who left Missouri when my grandpa was about 14 in the early 1900s, and the kids were pictured by that log cabin. So now to California. George H. and Jesse Foster moved to Compton, where he had a dairy for a while. Then they moved into the main part of town, and he did cement work. He helped in the building of Long Beach Boulevard. Then when the old Lugo General Store in Linwood was up for sale, George H. bought it and was back into the business he was familiar with. This is a picture of them with Daddy's cousin Billy, who was a son of Eva. And this is the newer store built just around the corner, and this is the one Daddy remembers. Here are some family photos of George H. and Jesse's family. On the far right is a picture of my dad with his grandparents when he was a couple years old. On the left are great-grandma Webb and great-grandma Alstrom, that's my grandma Webb's side of the family, with Daddy's 3 oldest sisters, and at the bottom is a picture of Daddy in a high chair with his 4 sisters behind him, probably around 1925, on the Snodgrass Ranch, which belonged to Aunt Eva and Uncle Pete Snodgrass, located in Linwood. Young George Lulian helped his folks with deliveries for the market, but after he married Catherine Corinne Alstrom in 1911, he began farming, and that's what he did for the rest of his life, running a dairy, raising sugar beets and other crops. Here's a picture of Grandpa working with his brother Aubrey, and another of him hauling sugar beets with a team of 8. Grandpa and Grandma built a home in Linwood where they raised their family. Here are 2 views of Grandma and Grandpa Webb's home. The first was taken before the Long Beach earthquake. The second picture was later. You can see the bushes and trees were a lot bigger, but notice, the chimney's gone. It fell off during the Long Beach earthquake of 1933. And there's Grandma and Grandpa in front of their home in Linwood, probably in the 1950s. The house is still standing today, by the way. And here are just a couple of pictures I found online of some of the earthquake damage in Linwood, although most of the damage was in Long Beach. Well, the farming life is what my dad grew up with and what he enjoyed also. After he and my mom, Hazel Eileen Olson, were married in 1945, he worked on several ranches, including Grandpa Olson's ranch up here in the AV on Avenue A, just west of where we all grew up. And here around 1950 or 51, Mama, Judy, and I are at Grandpa Olson's with Daddy's red International truck, which he used for hauling hay. And then we moved to several other places where Daddy worked on ranches in Blythe, Hemet, and near Thousand Oaks for short periods of time. Around 1952, we came back to the Antelope Valley for good, and my dad got a job with Ritter and Godey. We moved into a house on one of the Ritter and Godey ranches west of Roseman, and that place has been home ever since. Here are Judy, Dwayne, Jane, and me, and we're probably on our way to church. Grandma and Grandpa Webb moved up here eventually, and Grandpa worked for Ritter and Godey too on the Alfalfa Ranch where we lived. The top picture shows Grandpa pulling the hay loader and wagon. Daddy was doing the hard work, loading the hay onto the trailer and stacking it. Below, I'm driving, but this is the load of straw, and the bales were a lot more slippery. I learned you had to go straight over the borders between each bed. Otherwise, you might lose the load. Daddy didn't come off, but I think he had to restack some of the bales. About 1956, Southern Kern Unified School District broke ground on the new Tropico School, which was built for the country kids from grades 1 through 6. Due to overcrowding, a number of classes were being held in churches around the town, Wayside Chapel, the Baptist Church, and others. On the big day, students were bussed in, the band played, scouts presented the flag, and dignitaries were there. I can see Jack Eubanks from Wayside Chapel, and I think that's Lily McWhorter in the blue coat. Do you recognize anyone else? Then the teachers actually turned shovels of dirt. Mrs. Swayze, Mrs. Hazelrig in that furry coat, and Mrs. Williams, the principal, to name a few. When my Aunt Corinne and her husband Thurman celebrated their silver anniversary in 1957, it was an opportunity for a bunch of wonderful family pictures. Here are two that show our part of the Webb family here in California. The first is with Grandma and Grandpa and their 4 daughters and 2 sons. Daddy's the tall one on the right. And the second picture is Grandma and Grandpa and their kids and the spouses and all the grandkids up to that time. I'm the one down in front hiding behind my cousin. With those old cameras, the sun was always in our eyes. Looking at the picture on the right, can you tell who the 2 farmers are? Well-tanned faces and white foreheads. Growing up on an alfalfa ranch in the 50s and 60s was a lot of fun. Grandpa had farmed with horses and still had his riding horse, Rev, which he raised and trained and brought up here when they moved. I always wished for a golden palomino like his, but when I got Dickens, I was just happy to have any horse I could ride. Growing up on the alfalfa ranch meant seeing Daddy bale hay and other farming activities. Besides, sometimes I rode out there on my bike with his cereal and milk for breakfast, as he had to leave early to start baling. Our house is back in those trees on the left. Of course, there were other crops grown too. This is a field of wheat in the bottom picture. Growing up here meant getting pictures taken in the fields. Judy was pictured in a cotton field just to the north of where we lived. Jane is in a wheat field. You might be able to tell how itchy that wheat was if you look carefully at her. In the bottom picture here, Daddy is harvesting Milo, and Mama got pictures of both Judy and Jane in the Milo field. When we were young, our cousins often came up for the 4th of July. Someone would bring fireworks, and the whole day was spent in anticipation of the display once it got dark. Judy has some caps in her hands. We had been trying to make some kind of an extra display of lights by doing something with them, but it didn't exactly work out. And check out the 2 younger kids, Jane and Carol. They look a little worried. Growing up on the ranch meant we got to play on the equipment. Big tractors, harvesters, etc. This is a big earth mover that was used in developing the new ranch out west on 140th and Avenue B. Here, Pete Ritter and Daddy are working on leveling land out west. You can see for miles towards Lancaster and Palmdale. On the right, they're getting the grain tank built. The view is to the north. It would hold the wheat or barley after the harvest, and the lower left picture is the new reservoir holding water and the new crop planted just to the south of it. This shot was taken from the top of the new grain tank. Daddy said they filled the tank as they worked on it so they could reach the higher parts more easily. There were a lot of sheep raised here in the early days. If the sheep herders came across lambs whose mothers couldn't or wouldn't care for them, they sometimes brought them to us, and we would bottle feed the bummer lambs. The herds were moved all over for feed. Here they're in the fields out west, up against the foothills if you drove out Roseman Boulevard as far as you could drive. Sometimes we had calves to feed too. And I remember how exciting it was to be woken up in the middle of the night to go out and watch for the X-15 to fly over when it was being tested. Of course, this is a picture from one of the air shows at Edwards. Then there were the smaller planes to watch. Daddy and his brother Jack built and flew several radio-controlled airplanes. And everyone needs poppy pictures. These were taken in 1959s. The fields were absolutely beautiful. Here's Grandma Webb, Daddy, and my brother Dwayne out in the poppies. The PTA in Roseman put on great Halloween carnivals with food booths, games, and of course the parade. All the kids wore their costumes and it was really exciting. When Spade Cooley was here and building his Water Wonderland Park out on 90th West, he got involved in community activities. His kids were in the 4-H, and here he was the Grand Marshal of the parade, I believe. The driver may be Mr. Rollins from Lancaster. The Old Gray Mares were a softball team, and this was their mascot, with Francis Eubanks leading the mare. I believe Pat Randleman and a Mrs. Keebaugh served as the mare itself. And then there was the 4-H float. I think Judy is sitting in a desk on it. And it looks like Gene Smith from Wilmar Farms is driving and maybe using one of Wilmar's old trucks. He was one of the original leaders of our 4-H club, and some of his kids are also on the float. Here are just some pictures of typical happenings when we were kids. Looks like we had new outfits for Easter. And the Christmas picture shows some new pajamas. And we girls had curlers in our hair, and there's our new baby brother. In the picture with Dale's birthday cake, Judy seems to be a little upset because Dale had just reached out for some of his own cake, and I think he's licking his fingers. More pictures, so many with alfalfa in the background. Grandma and Grandpa Webb's 50th anniversary, and you can see all the grandkids here except for the last one wasn't born yet. Their family had really grown, and now we have another horse, so 3 of us can ride together. In 1961, Corral 58 had a hike at Willow Springs. We learned that the big mule teams came through town and how the mules had to step over the wagon tongue, one mule at a time, on the inside of the turn and then back again after a few steps to make the corner coming into town. The man in the center is the Corral 58 president, Sam Duran, and at the right is Glenn Settle, but I don't know who the man is on the left. Another parade, this time in Quartz Hill for the Almond Blossom Festival. Gladys Adams was a member of Corral 58. There are a couple of friends and me on the right, and Sam Duran at the center in the lower picture. He was the president of ETI, and that's Equestrian Trails Incorporated. Southern Kern schools had great field trips for each grade level when we were going through school, and the 8th grade trip was the best. We got to go to Catalina on the big white steamer, and the PTA mothers and the students worked so hard to raise money for these field trips and for other school projects. Here at the top is Mr. Purcell, one of our teachers, with some friends and me on the steamship. At right are Mr. and Mrs. Lawson, the school superintendent. Mr. Lawson is the one who had come by back when I was starting the 3rd grade and told my folks we were supposed to be going to Roseman, not Del Sur, which was in LA County, since we lived on the Kern County side of Avenue A, and we finally switched schools. One of the activities at Catalina that we got to do was a trail ride, and the Lawsons participated in all of these activities too. And the Lawsons were also involved in showing horses and ponies. They had their farm out west of Rosamond. Below is another float in a parade. This one is from the PTA group. This float is from the PTA group, and the blackboard reminds everyone to vote in the coming trustee election. Jane is on this one in the center. Of course, reservoirs meant summer fun, and once this one even froze over hard enough that we could skate on it. Another family sight was the crop dusters. Look how low he was. They were known to sometimes fly under the power lines. 4-H activities kept us busy too. Judy's washing her lamb for the fair, and at right, Darwin Smith and I are washing our steers at the Kern County Fair. Gene Smith from Wilmar was our beef leader, and he's standing by the other wash rack. The red ribbon meant my steer had made it to the auction, which was the goal of all the kids showing animals. For those who don't think it snows here, take a look. In 1962, we had a big snowstorm. In some pictures, in some places, there was hardly any snow, but in other places, it was piled high. In the lower right picture, Jane is out on Avenue A, where the snow was especially deep on the south side of the trees. Judy's 4-H had triplets during the snowstorm. In the corrals, where we had steers and horses. The snow kept us out and the animals in for several days. The steers could move eventually, but one of our horses was stuck in his pen for quite a little while. Another ETI event was a trail ride and camp out to see the Indian rock art near Horse Thief Canyon up in the Tehachapi's. As you can see, our camp out and the riders are starting to get ready to head out. That's Russ Lancaster, Jerry Williams, and Chuck Fitz, and me playing the accordion. And then there's a picture of Dwayne up at the Indian paintings. In 1964, Corral 58 chose me to be the queen and represent our corral at the annual Equestrian Trails Incorporated Horse Show and Queen Contest in Costa Mesa. It was a great experience, and Ray made me put these pictures in. More tractor work. For a number of years, they raised sugar beets out west. They topped the beets, dug them, and then loaded them into trucks and hauled the beets to the Union Sugar Dump in Roseman. From there, they went by train to the Holly Sugar Plant out at Betaravia. It was an interesting time. The bottom right picture shows the new Ferris wheel type digger. In 1969, Mama was honored at the PTA Founders Day program. The article says Mrs. Hartman presented the award. All our family was there for the special recognition. It seems Mama didn't get into many pictures because she was always behind the camera, but this trip to Monterey, when Mama and Daddy went with Judy to take Charlie back up to basic training at Fort Ord, so of course Judy was able to get a picture of the two of them. And more wildflowers, 1968. Looks like another great year. Daddy was on the motorcycle and Mama rode along behind. And another big snowstorm. This was in 1973. Love the view looking out under the ice crystals across the fields far to the north. After the snow, the flowers were beautiful again. That's me in the field. And here's Mama with her first granddaughter. And I had to put this 1974 8th grade graduation picture in. If you went through Hamilton Junior High or Tropical Middle School, you probably went through the whole graduation process. And look who is walking out with my brother Dale, Kelly Julian Gonzalez. The beet dump in Roseman is all gone now, but it was a busy place in the 60s and 70s and 80s. The trucks had to pull up on the scaled away and then dump their loads into the waiting cars. When they dumped those big heavy beets, you could hear it rumble all over town. As part of the celebration leading up to the bicentennial, the Freedom Train came through Roseman in 1975. It was beautiful. As you can see, some more beet trucks at the left in the bottom of the picture, by the way. Does anyone have a penny that they put on the track before the steam train came through? And once all 5 of us kids were in school, my mom went to work outside the home. First, she worked at Kleiner's fabric store in Lancaster. She'd always made a lot of our clothes, and it was natural choice for work because she knew a lot about fabrics and sewing and all the net accessories. Later, she went to beauty school and eventually ended up with her own shop in Roseman, Eileen's Beauty Salon. And here, at her retirement, which was held at the shop, with her friends and co-workers. Gladys Adams is in the hairdryer chair, and Patty Youngblood is pinning on Mama's corsage. At another time, several of us took a natural history class from AV College. How many can you recognize in this field trip picture? I see Gretchen Winfrey, Greta Castle, and Debbie McKee. The top picture here is an old one which shows Daddy bringing a load of hay, or old Alice Chalmers pulling the harrow bed automatic hay loader. By the way, the Antelope Valley Rural Museum's website says this about that the automatic hay loader. Before New Holland bought the patent rights, these machines were invented and developed on the east side of the Antelope Valley at the B.C. Gray Dairy. They're named harrow bed, which was their daughter Deborah's name reversed. Anyway, later on, Daddy was working in closed-in cabs with GPS installed and with heating and air conditioning. And I don't think you're ever too old to get a ride in a tractor. That's me hitching a ride with my dad. At the right, he's checking the grain drill. He continued working for Ritter and Godey up until 2011, and he retired when he was 87 years old. These last 2 pictures were on Godey's ranch near Hawthorne, Nevada. And here are my folks in 1979. As you probably know, George and Eileen had 5 children. We've all stayed pretty close to home, working, raising families, etc. in the Roseman area. My mom passed away in 2013, but my dad is still the patriarch of the Webb family. And I think this picture includes just about everyone, kids, grandkids, plus some cousins and friends. That was Thanksgiving 2017. And that's all.